Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. All right, today, folks, we are going to be talking about something that is, once again, rather practical. We are going to be talking about the issue of car reliability. We are going to be discussing what makes a car reliable, how the reliability of cars of old compares to the reliability of cars of new, and whether or not cars are actually becoming less reliable like so many people claim that they are becoming less reliable, including myself. I believe that cars are becoming less reliable, but I don't believe that for no reason. So today you're going to find out why I believe that cars are becoming less reliable and how I've basically come down to this conclusion. So let's get started. Here we have segment one. First of all, let us try to discuss and try to find out what exactly makes a car reliable. We can't just say, oh, cars are becoming less reliable unless we define what reliability is. So what does it mean for a car to be reliable? Well, there are varying definitions, as you can tell. There are varying types of people in the car world, various types of cars. So obviously there's going to be various definitions of reliability. Let's just say some people want a car that can handle abuse. Other people want a car that is easy to fix. Others want a car that is well built. I personally believe that it is a combination of the three factors. A car that is easy to fix, a car that is well built, and a car that is able to handle abuse. A combination of those three factors would make a car reliable. Of course, it depends on the car. Let me just take an example. Strictly speaking, cars that are the most basic tend to be the most reliable, simply because there is less moving parts. There is less possibility for something to go wrong when you don't have so many features that are loaded into a car. For example, your Toyota Corollas will obviously tend to be more reliable than your Cadillac DeVilles, because your Cadillac DeVilles have a lot of technology, have a lot of features, have a lot of fuses, have a lot of electrics, other things of that sort, more things to go wrong. Your Toyota Corolla, especially of 15, 20 years ago, was a super basic car, roll-up windows, no power locks, nothing of that sort that's going to go bad over time, because frankly there was just nothing of that sort in them. So this is what exactly I mean. Reliability will always be a relative term. Compared to luxury cars, especially compared to most luxury cars, a Cadillac DeVille is pretty reliable. But compared to all cars, not really. Compared to economy cars, a Toyota Corolla is extremely reliable. But compared to, a pickup truck, a Toyota Corolla is not the most reliable if we're taking like a pickup truck or something. So it's always a relative term, reliability. Back to what I was saying, however. Cars with simple mechanics are generally more basic cars are typically better and more reliable. Let me tell you why. There's less moving parts. There's less electrical components. All means less to go wrong, and basically it means that there is less things to have to change in a car. Let me take an example. Toyota Corolla versus Mercedes-Benz S-Class. And now you will find that I will go back to Toyota Corolla, Toyota Camry, because these cars are simple. These cars are easy to work on. These cars have a reputation for reliability like no other car. And they are super easy to fix. They are cheap to fix, and they are able to handle abuse. This is what basically makes them a wonderful car. This is basically the formula for a Japanese car, is the fact that they are cheap, they are made with durable materials, and they can take a beating. However, you take a Mercedes-Benz S-Class. Not to say that Mercedes-Benz S-Classes are unreliable per se. I'm not going to believe that they're the most reliable car on earth, and I'm not going to pretend that there hasn't been some that have been infinitely reliable for their owners. But you take things such as the airmatic suspension that came out with these cars, especially if we're talking about the W220 model from 2000 to 2006 in the North American market. Air suspension on those cars, if one strut went bad, the entire system went bad. When the entire system went bad, there's no fail-safe, and you're stuck. That's unreliable. This Chrysler product, which I am going to say it's a Chrysler product, because at the time that this Mercedes-Benz S-Class was made, Chrysler and Mercedes-Benz were merged in the Daimler Chrysler, had a bunch of electrical issues. Quality suffered that time, especially compared to what Mercedes-Benz used to make as far as the S-Class. The W220 S-Class is largely considered the worst S-Class of all time, coming right after the W140 S-Class, which was considered the best S-Class of all time, and probably the most reliable as well. So reliability is always going to be a relative term. You're going to want cars that are built with good materials as well, not prone to rust, and parts don't disintegrate. I've said in a previous podcast that rust is to cars just as cancer is to people. If someone has cancer, their cancer could spread. Rust is the same way. If your car has rust, no matter how good your engine has been, no matter how good your transmission has been, your car is on borrowed time, especially with structural rust, because you will get to a point where your car will literally be falling apart and you can't drive it anymore. And in some states where you have inspections, it's not going to pass inspection. A car that's rusting away, a car that has biodegradable parts, yes, Mercedes-Benz, I'm looking at you with your biodegradable wiring harnesses from like the 1980s, early 90s, which is absolutely ridiculous. If your car doesn't have parts that are going to last, no matter how good your engine or transmission is, at the end of the day, an engine or transmission are not the only thing that make a car. You need parts that are going to last. You need build quality. You need stuff that's not going to rust. You need things that are not going to disintegrate over time. You need parts that are going to hold up. A lot of people tend to think that reliability is simply just engine and transmission. No. That couldn't be further from the truth. Reliability has several factors. Reliability has even, dare I say, availability of parts. Because I like to think that reliability is exactly what the name suggests it to be. Can you rely on your car? A lot of people, a lot of purists, and frankly, I'm sort of guilty of this too, will tell you, well, they don't make them like they used to, which a lot of times refers to the build quality of a car. And I'm not going to pretend like I haven't said that. I've said that plenty of times. However, I will also concede to the fact that if you drive an older car, parts are becoming harder to find, especially when your car is in that 15 to 20 year range, and especially if it's in the 20 to 25 year range. And if you're talking 25 year plus, I mean, especially depending on the car, parts are very difficult to find. And here I'm going to tell you why I don't consider a car with parts that are hard to find to be reliable. You can't rely on that car. And I'm going to tell you why you can't rely on it. If something breaks, you know you're going to have to go on a wild goose chase just to get a part. That's not a car that's reliable anymore. No matter how good the car was from the factory, no matter how good it's held up over the years, if parts availability is scarce, they are beginning to make less of them, or they stop producing those parts in general, it's getting to the point where you have to ask yourself, is it time to upgrade? Is it time for you to get another car? And I'm speaking completely realistically, not speaking out of emotion here, because emotionally, I will tell you that my Buick Park Avenue, I'm never getting rid of it, and I'll ideally still be driving it 40 years from now, which there are some people who do that. But I'm already beginning to find it hard to find parts for my car, especially the fact that it's a luxury car, an aging luxury car. Every once in a while, some quirky thing breaks. I mean, in the last podcast, you all heard about my horn. You all heard about what foolishness I had to go through just to get the horn/airbag assembly changed. And that's not the only thing. My turning signal flasher went. These are literally the most obscure parts ever. About a year and a half ago, I had a supercharger bypass valve that ended up breaking, and I had to go to the Buick dealership to get the part. It was a dumb little $10 piece of plastic that went under the hood that connected my supercharger to like the manifold that it adapts to on the engine block, something like that. And one of the most obscure parts ever, the plastic was just so brittle after 16, 17 years of being on the car that it just disintegrated when my mechanic was working on it. So I ended up having to miss days of work because I was down away from where I was working. I was down in Cape Coral. I used to work in Tampa at the time. I had to search several different auto parts stores. Every single one of them told me it was a dealer-only item, so I had to go to the dealer. I had to order it from the parts department. I had to wait 2 days before it came in. I mean, this is what happens when you begin to own an older car. Not to say that there is not merit to the claim that older cars tend to be more reliable, and I will tell you my thoughts about that later on in this podcast. But I will tell you that build quality, the car being able to handle abuse, reliability, those are all things that are considered in reliability. There is a lot more. And of course, parts availability is in it too. At least with new cars, you know that there will be an aftermarket. And you know that the manufacturer even is going to continue to manufacture parts for that car. If you go in and you drive a 93 F-150, you might go in and be able to find a part at a auto parts store because F-150s are super common. But let's say you go in and you drive a 93 Acura Vigor or something that is obscure like that. I mean, Acura Vigors, just like Acuras from the 90s, Acura Legends, Acura Vigors, RLs, TLs, are all known for being extremely reliable. I mean, Honda makes some of the most reliable cars on earth. However, when you get a car that's rare, no matter how reliable it is, especially if it hasn't been around for such a long time, or it's been around for such a long time, and parts are beginning to, not be manufactured anymore. I can go into the auto parts store with my 93 Acura Vigor, and I can say I need a window regulator motor, and they're going to be like, man, we don't carry that anymore. It might be a week or two before we can get one, or you might have to check your local junkyard. And I can tell you, I've been to several junkyards. I've never seen an Acura Vigor. They're just that uncommon. So no matter how accurate you may be in assessing your car's reliability. If you get to a point where your car is so old you can't find parts for it anymore, no matter how durable the engine and transmission of the car can be, the car is becoming less and less reliable simply due to the fact that parts are becoming less and less available. So parts availability is definitely a huge thing when considering car reliability. Not just the regular things of, can the car handle abuse? Is it easy to fix? And is it well built? So please stay tuned for the next segment in which I'm going to be talking about cars of old. Basically, we're going to be talking about the reliability issues that cars used to have back in the old days and how they compare to new cars. And if you stay tuned till the very end, you will hear my thoughts on car reliability, and I will give you a list on some of the most reliable cars of a certain era, and you will soon find out what era I'm speaking of. So please stay tuned after the break.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Okay, welcome back, wonderful car people. I hope you enjoyed our little commercial break there. This is segment 2 of the podcast. In segment 1, we discuss generally what does reliability mean, and I made sure to mention that parts availability should be considered in reliability as well. So in this segment, we are going to be discussing the cars of old. What made the cars of old reliable? What made them unreliable? What sorts of issues did they have? Okay, so I addressed this semi-myth of they don't make them like they used to. This is usually referring to, once again, build quality. I've been known to say this. I have known other people to say this. I've known several people to say this, especially people who drive older cars. They talk about cars with their buddy, and let's say their buddy just got the brand new 2020 model, and he's looking at it, and then he's kind of scoffing. He'd be like, "Oh wow, you got all that technology, but there's a lot of plastic on this thing." And then he goes over to his car and he slaps the fender, and he's like, "Well, they don't make them like they used to." And this is sort of a half myth, because when referring to build quality, wow, we ought to be glad they don't make them like they used to, because cars of old were death traps as far as reliability and safety goes. Of course, this is not a podcast about safety, but it ought to be mentioned too that cars have not only gotten more reliable over time, they also have gotten more safe over time too. Cars today hold a candle, hold a giant looming candle, just to stretch the analogy, over cars of old as far as build quality goes. The stark contrast, especially, can most dramatically be seen in economy cars. For example, the Ford Fiesta, even though the Ford technically no longer makes the Fiesta because they stopped making cars, they're only making the Mustang and SUVs and crossovers. But the Ford Fiesta is a modern econobox. It's a modern economy car. And the Ford Pinto is a classic economy car, an econobox, if you will. And we can see the stark contrast between the build quality of a Ford Pinto and a Ford Fiesta. Same thing goes with like a Chevy Chevette or a Chevy Vega versus a Chevy Spark of today, or versus a Chevy Cruze of today. I mean, there is almost no comparison. A Ford Fiesta is going to be infinitely more reliable than a Ford Pinto. And I'm not talking about because the Ford Pinto is nearly 50 years old. I'm talking about when both of these were brand new, it is going to be more reliable. Here's the reason why. Ford Pinto especially was prone to rust. And not to mention the fact that when these cars were rear-ended, they were known for having an affinity to blow up because the rear bumper was basically right in front of the gas tank. It was a terribly unsafe design, and frankly, if your car can't handle being rear-ended and then driving away, I mean, is your car really reliable? If you have to worry about your car blowing up if someone hits your front, if someone hits your rear bumper, even if they hit it with a bit of force, you're probably not driving a very reliable vehicle. That's just one example. It's outstanding. It's outrageous, honestly. Not even outstanding. Outstanding is a good word. It's outrageous how badly built some cars from the 70s were, some cars from the 60s were. I mean, especially when you get into the area of economy cars. I mean, these cars were genuine, rolling piles of steaming crap. I mean, they came from the factory that way. There are several cars, within a few years, rust would already take them over. This was a huge problem, especially from the 60s to the 80s, especially in the 70s. Pre-60s, rust wasn't a huge deal because, frankly, the metal that they made the cars with back then was thicker, it was better, and these were cars that, they hadn't started cutting costs so much until the 60s and the 70s came around. Car manufacturers really began cutting costs to see how much bang they can get for their buck and how many cars they can actually produce. And this created a problem in reliability, obviously, because when they started cutting corners, they started cutting corners with the materials that they made for the cars, and they started cutting corners as far as the build quality of the cars themselves. I have heard numerous stories from the old ladies that I used to work with at Hallmark, most of which, in fact, were functioning adults in the 70s. And we're talking about, by the time the 70s rolled around, these women were 20, 30, in some cases even in their 40s by the time the 70s rolled around. So they can remember distinctly driving cars. I mean, I believe it was Teresa who told me that one of her first cars, she was driving it and literally the transmission fell out from underneath her because the car was just built that badly. And then she had to end up getting the car replaced because they couldn't fix it. This was a car from the 70s. I couldn't exactly remember what car she told you. But today, I mean, if a transmission fell out from beneath your car, that car manufacturer is liable to get sued, is liable to get, millions of cars to recall, spend millions of dollars fixing all of those cars. Back in those days, there was none of that foolishness. So keep in mind that I'm talking about when these cars were new, not, of course, the cars of today. Of course, the cars of today, you can't explain to me that a 70s car is going to be more reliable than the car that's made, in 2020. That's just simply not the case. I'm talking about when the cars were new. But yeah, that's just an example of, a story that I heard about build quality in cars of the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. It was, some cars were just terribly bad. Not just Pintos, obviously. Several cars were prone to rusting out, major components failing, other major build quality disasters. I mean, there has to be other things of that time period. Fieros were made back in the 80s. Fieros, were known, to catch on fire tires sometimes because of, something was wrong with, I think, the fuel lines, and they would leak onto the intake manifold and get really hot, blah, blah, blah. I mean, Fieros were known for blowing up. Pintos were known for blowing up. Granted, those cars aren't from the exact same time period, but there was some overlap there. I mean, there were several cars. Of course, I pick on these two because these are the two that I can think of off the top of my head. But there were several cars of that time period that were simply just not reliable. They were bona fide death traps. And not only death traps in terms of safety, they were simply not any good as far as driving a car for practicality or reliability or build quality or frankly anything that goes. However, I will say there is a notable exception. Early vehicles, especially from the brass era, that were often made by smaller companies that hand-built cars before mass production and cost-cutting measures, were extremely reliable, typically from luxury automakers. This is where your cars like the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost come in. I had a podcast not too long ago on the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, and I hope that you all listen to it. The Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost was the best car in the world at the time that it was being produced. It was hailed by the Auto Car publication as being the best car in the world. These cars were overbuilt. They were heavy duty. They were rugged. They were quiet. They were simple to fix. They were super reliable. So much so to the point that they use these cars in armored car form in combat, in live combat situations. I mean, they were that rugged that the military believed in these cars so much that they had 120 of them commissioned to, roll around in warfare with armor on them. I mean, this is crazy. You just can't find that from a regular car nowadays. And before I just repeat the entire old podcast, I'm going to tell you that brass and Edwardian era cars, especially from the time period in which before mass production was super common in cars. Of course, at the time you had Henry Ford, Ransom Olds were mass producing vehicles. But I'm talking about some of those smaller boutique car companies that really, I guess, took pride and hand-built their cars. They made their cars with the finest materials, and it is not unsurprising for you to see a car from that time period rolling around today in original condition, unrestored, and still kicking. I mean, granted, these cars are many times over 100 years old, so it's not like you're going to see this car on your way to your local Walmart and whatnot. But you will find that a lot of them surprisingly are still running. And we're talking about cars that were made 100 years ago. They're still running. Do you know why they're still running? Because they were super well built, super well engineered, and they were super reliable and simple. That's why. And of course, as cars became more popular, there was a larger demand. So car companies ended up having to to do cost-cutting measures, and then cars ended up becoming less reliable as a result. So I will tell you, car reliability over the years is much like a roller coaster. It was super bad at first, then became good, at least with some car companies, then became bad pretty much across the board, then started becoming good again. And now, I mean, depending on how you look at it, it might be staying good, it might be getting bad. That depends on how you look at it. And of course, I'll discuss that later on. These cars were typically from luxury automakers. So not even your average car. Because even like I mentioned, in the brass and Edwardian era, cars had only been invented about 20, 25 years earlier. I mean, we're talking about 1905, 1906 year. Cars were invented in 1886. So they had just begun to move away from the horseless carriages, and cars of that time period were smelly, they were loud, they were not very good. So, of course, cars that were built well were obviously from luxury automakers. This is not your average car we're talking about, but nonetheless, some of them are still very reliable. In terms of simple mechanics, I will say, cars of old definitely win in this category. You had no start-stop features. You had no radar cruise control. you had no digital displays on your dashboard that you had to worry that were going to stop working after a while. You didn't have anything. Simple mechanics and simple electrics. Whereas nowadays, things like this are becoming more common. But I will say, in terms of build quality, new cars have this in the bag. There is no such thing as new cars aren't as built well as cars of old. I will tell you, some cars of old are more sturdy. They are heavier, but that doesn't necessarily equate build quality. Because you can have a super heavy car with a super heavy chrome bumper that falls off. Just because it's heavy doesn't mean it's necessarily going to stay in place. Just because it's heavy doesn't necessarily mean it's built well. It's simply that. It's heavy. You can have a car these days with a plastic bumper and be like, these cars are cheap. They're not reliable, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I tend to gripe and moan and complain, especially when I had my Honda Civic and pieces of plastic would fall off of it all the time. I tend to gripe and moan and complain, cars these days are made of plastic, blah, blah, blah. But they're still well built. They are still built better than cars of old. Just because plastic is a more lightweight material doesn't mean if it's fitted to a car that automatically makes the car unreliable. I mean, heck, Toyota Corollas of a certain time period and even today had still loads of plastic on them. These cars are still largely made of plastic. But goodness, these cars are some of the most reliable cars you can buy on the road. So just because a car has plastic on it doesn't mean it's unreliable. Just because a car is lightweight doesn't mean it's unreliable. Just because a car doesn't have chrome bumpers, just like cars of old used to have, doesn't mean it's unreliable. So I have to say, it's thankful, or we should be thankful, I should say, that cars nowadays really aren't made like they used to be, because you would have transmissions falling out, just like happened to Teresa. You would have rust within 3-4 years of buying your car brand new. I mean, there would be a lot of things that would go bad. A lot of cars would end up getting recalled, and a lot of people would be spending a lot of money. So, thank you for listening. We're not over yet, but we just have another commercial break. And in the next segment, we are going to be discussing new cars. What makes new cars unreliable? What makes them reliable as compared to cars that came previously? And in the last segment, stay tuned. You're going to hear me concerning my personal thoughts and concerning some of the cars I believe are the most reliable cars of all time. So please stay tuned after the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Alrighty then, welcome back, folks. Now we're going to be talking about new cars. Okay, let me preface by saying this. Though they are better built, the trouble comes with lack of mechanical simplicity. I'm going to say it. Cars these days are too complicated. And let me tell you why. There are several things that make cars these days too complicated. What has once been reserved for the most expensive cars has finally trickled down to the cheaper cars. Let me explain. Years ago, they were putting digital dashboards in cars. GM was doing it in the late 80s. Some Japanese luxury cars like the Toyota Crown, Nissan Cedric, Toyota Century, Nissan President, those cars had been using digital dashboards in late 80s, early 90s too. I mean, the Germans, it took them a while to do digital dashboards, but those cars have been using digital dashboards. Nowadays, you can go in and buy the cheapest car on the lot that's brand new, and it will have a digital dashboard. Even though in those days, those cars that I mentioned were $80,000 new with digital dashboards. And if you're talking about an American car, maybe $50,000 new, adjusted for inflation, of course, in today's money with digital dashboards. I mean, this was not a feature that your regular, everyday Econobox had. These are digital dashboards that were once reserved for the top of the line models. And they are no longer. They finally gotten to the point where they've reached the everyday vehicle, the layman's car, if you will. The thing that gets him from point A to point B. They have finally reached this. So this is where that's becoming a problem. Let me just explain before I get too in-depth what exactly makes all this stuff unreliable. We're going to be first talking about the engine of cars nowadays. So, engines for the longest while were most commonly naturally aspirated, meaning they were not boosted, they were not supercharged, they were not turbocharged, they were just naturally aspirated. The car breathed normally, naturally, without any aid from a boosting mechanism. Okay. Well, and I've even heard car YouTubers on YouTube talk about this. I tend to think of Scotty Kilmer. Scotty Kilmer, he's a quirky man, but the man knows his stuff. And he drives a 1994 Toyota Celica. Is he ever going to get rid of that car? Absolutely not. And he's like, this is one of the most reliable cars ever made. So Scotty is definitely an old car type of person. He believes that old cars are more reliable than cars of new, which I can't completely argue with him for the simple point is, when you take these small displacement, high output, high stressed engines that are not naturally aspirated but are many times turboed, you are putting so much stress on your engine. A four-banger, meaning a four-cylinder car, should not be producing 360-something horsepower that's turbocharged driving the front wheels of your car. That's absolutely ludicrous. Those cars don't need to be doing that. They don't need to be making that much power, and the engine needs not be so stressed. I am saying this because a lot of manufacturers are putting these small output or small displacement, high output, turbocharged, highly stressed, high revving engines in their cars. And as we can see of cars of old, for example, my friend Alana had a 2007 Audi A4. Her 2007 Audi A4, by the time she finally got rid of it, had about 150,000 miles on it, and the turbo was about to go. And that's an expensive part to replace. The same thing's going to be happening with your regular everyday Ford, your regular everyday Chevy, your regular everyday Nissan or Toyota even though I love Toyota and their reliability. I mean, they're guilty of doing this too. Your regular everyday car is going to be caught to a point where 10 years from now, which 10 years is not terribly old for a car, you're going to end up having to replace turbos. You're going to end up having to, take care of an engine that has been highly stressed its entire life. Whereas cars of old, for example, I have a Buick 3800 engine, and the Buick 3800 is not nearly as old as some other engines that I could even mention here. It's 3.8 liters. It's a rather large displacement V6. The car, even though mine is supercharged, it's not highly stressed. It's more of a lazy supercharger. It doesn't rev super high, and the car is not constantly under a load that is pushing it to make as much power as possible, that is pushing it to go as fast as possible, that's putting stress on my engine block, that's putting stress on my transmission, that's doing all of that. Cars these days they were born stressed, if I could put it that way. They come stressed from the factory. They come with high revving engines that are trying to make a lot of horsepower, that are trying to be as efficient as possible and using about a less amount of space as possible, and they end up becoming pretty stressed, if I could put it that way. That's not a good thing. Yes, you may enjoy driving your four-banger that makes 300 horsepower, but your car is not going to enjoy having to make that much power all the time, and eventually it will snap. It will snap. Something's going to go wrong because engines were never meant to be that highly stressed. I tend to think of the Bentley 8-liter back in the day. Jay Leno reviewed a car that was similar to this, a Bentley of the 1920s, 1930s. These cars, some of them had, oh my gosh, we're talking about 8-9 liter engines. These engines were massive. These cylinders were huge. We're talking about 3 spark plugs per cylinder just to cover the surface area to get the spark to ignite the fuel and air mixture. I mean, these things were ludicrously large and overbuilt. They were not efficient, but they were super simple, and they did the job, and they were infinitely reliable. One of the reasons why? Because the engines were low stress. They were large. They produced the power that they needed to produce, but the power that they produced was sufficient. The power that they produced was smoothly delivered. The power that they produced was not under a huge load of stress, just like many cars of today are under a huge load of stress. That's just to show you that, even down to their engines, cars these days are not as reliable as cars of old when it comes to mechanical simplicity, that is. We have the prevalence of start-stop systems in cars. It seems that cars are becoming more and more efficient, which is not a bad thing, because I don't want to be stuck driving a Cadillac Fleetwood of 1960s that gets 10 miles to the gallon, maybe 11 on a good day. I don't want to be stuck doing that. It's good that cars are becoming more efficient, but we ought to be careful in what sorts of measures we take to make our cars more efficient. Is it really all what it's cracked up to be? To have a car that every single time you stop at a stoplight, it turns off, and then it turns back on. What's going to happen when you've burned out your ignition, because cars are not meant to be turning off and turning back on that way? What happens when you burn out your ignition, and then you're at a stoplight one day, your car turns off as normal, and then it doesn't turn back on? What are you going to do then? Nobody has yet to answer me that question. This is one of my biggest gripes with my Honda Civic Hybrid, was the fact that it used to do start and stop, and there was no way to turn it off. It's not like I can go into the infotainment center and then turn it off and opt out of it. Absolutely not. No, it was automatically included in that. And it just makes me so upset, because the thing is, it's not necessary. You are saving marginal amounts of fuel by turning off your engine for 30 seconds when you're stopped at a stop sign, or for maybe 2 minutes when you're stopped at a stoplight at an intersection. The risk is not worth the reward. The fact that that car 5, 6, 7 years from now, when it's no longer under warranty, that car does that to you, stops and doesn't turn back on, you're out of luck. You try starting your car, maybe it might turn back on, maybe not. I don't know. Yeah, that's for you to tell. That's for you to find out when the car finally does that to you, because at a point, it's not if, it's when. That's not a reliable car. That's not a car that I want to take and pay for, invest, and then drive for the next 20 years, like so many people have done with their cars, because you know those things are not going to last. I would rather buy a car that's older, that doesn't have that technology, and maintain it well so I don't have to worry about stuff like that breaking, instead of getting a brand new car and then trying my best to maintain it only when I know that the car is it's destined to fail. That's a problem. That's a huge problem. But moving on, we haven't even tackled the interior and the features of these cars. Oh my land. All of the screens. People, enough. Car manufacturers, enough. Your cars are not tablets. They are not smartphones. They are cars, for crying out loud. For Pete's sake. For the love of gravy. I mean, stop putting all the screens in the cars. Your gauge cluster doesn't need to be a screen. Your infotainment center, granted, should probably be a screen. But your climate controls don't need to be a screen. Everything in the car doesn't need to be a screen. Increasingly, so many things are being wrapped into the center screens of these cars, to the point where some cars, you have to turn up the radio using the screen. There is no longer a knob for you to turn up the volume on the radio. Some cars, instead of having seat controls that are on the seat themselves, you have to go into the screen and then change the seat control. Okay, nobody has ever been able to answer me this question. What happens when your screen goes out? What happens when your touch screen stops working? What happens when these things eventually fail? You take your iPhone. I'm holding my iPhone right now. You take this, in 10 years, this thing is not going to be working as well as it does now. Let that sink in. Granted, nobody keeps an iPhone or an iPad for 10 years. By that time, the technology is going to be so advanced, you're not going to want to keep it. However, people tend to keep cars for 10 years. The average age of vehicles on the road, as a matter of fact, is 12 and a half years old. So we're talking about people are keeping their cars for longer and longer. What happens when you buy a brand new 2020 Corolla and then less than a year into owning the car, your Apple CarPlay already begins to act up, your touch screen is acting wonky, and your car starts stopping on you because, it's quirky and has electrical issues already because there's just too many, dang electrical things in it. What happens then? That's exactly what happened to my friend Atlanta. With her 2020 Toyota Corolla, she's had the car for less than a year. The car is already in the shop. Problems with the touch screen, problems with the engine stopping on her while she's driving. I can guarantee you a 20-year-old Corolla would not do that because, frankly, those things did not exist for that car to do that. So here's the issue. Here's the issue. Cars these days are becoming terribly complicated. And now you're getting to the point where in order for you to work on these cars, not only do you have to be a mechanic, you have to be a computer programmer, and you have to be an electrician too. Your car mechanic should be just a mechanic. He shouldn't have to be an electrician. He shouldn't have to be a computer programmer just to get the oil changed on your car or something ridiculous as that. And as these integrated systems can't be turned off, you're going to have emergency braking, lane keep assist, radar cruise control, electronic keys, and so much more that if these systems fail, the results will be disastrous. Cars are no longer simple electrically or mechanically. You shouldn't need to have an electrician work on your car before your mechanic works on your car, and you shouldn't need a computer programmer to work on your car after your mechanic is done with it. Car manufacturers have long been practicing planned obsolescence, making cars so that they will eventually become useless so that the newest ones can be purchased. Don't be fooled. I'm not saying that all cars these days are completely unreliable in our basket cases, but just keep in mind that your car will get to a point where it will become useless, and probably more useless more quickly than cars of old used to be. I mean, a car from the 90s is still very useful. A car from today might not be very useful 20 years from now because, frankly, the systems are just not going to hold up. So, please stay tuned for the next segment in which I'm going to be discussing my personal thoughts on car reliability and some of the cars that I believe have been the most reliable cars of all time. So please stay tuned.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Okay, welcome back, folks. We've gotten to segment 4. What have I to say concerning car reliability? Okay, I will tell you that I was a philosophy minor during my undergrad at USF. And I learned one thing, and trust me, I'm going to relate this to the podcast. Aristotle once said, "Virtue is the mean between extremes," meaning that it is not good to go to one extreme or the other. The best path is the middle route. And I will tell you the same thing goes for purchasing a car when you have reliability concerns. It is not good to go very old, and it is not good to go very new either. It is best to stay in the middle. Cars are something rather fickle, if I could put it that way. Buying a very new car to avoid issues of reliability, or buying a very old car to avoid reliability concerns, are not the answer to your concerns. That's not the answer to your concerns. In order to determine whether or not cars are reliable, you have to wait a few years. And you really have to wait until they're no longer under warranty and they start being serviced by real mechanics who are going to be honest with you. Many times people, and my dad is guilty of doing this, he will tell you, "Oh yes, my Mercedes-Benz S-Class is very reliable. Look at all of the consumer reviews." Newsflash, most consumers know absolutely nothing about their cars, let's face it. They know that their cars are point A to point B machines, and some of them, in the case of this S-Class that I speak of, want a car that's nice and that is very well built to get them from point A to point B, but they know nothing about reliability. So this car could be hailed as reliable by 100 people because they own the car when it was under warranty. If anything broke, they went to Mercedes-Benz, they got it fixed for no cost out of pocket. They eventually even forget that these things broke because they didn't have to pay for it. And if it's something free, you're not going to remember it. So there could have been a bunch of gremlins that they had to go and get fixed at Mercedes-Benz. But the car never left me stranded, so therefore it must be reliable. The only way for you to truly find out if a car is reliable is if you ask mechanics that have been working on these cars. Once you read the mechanic reviews on cars like the W220 S-Class or cars like the most recent BMW 7 Series, especially some of the older ones. I mean, frankly, BMW 7 Series in general. You will read online that these people say, "Oh yeah, 4.5 out of 5 for reliability, blah, 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 all of this fools." No. All of that is a bunch of lies because consumers don't know their cars. You have to ask the mechanics. The mechanics are going to be honest with you. The mechanics are going to be like, "Yeah, avoid that car at all costs. Tons of problems. Absolute pile of rolling steam of crap." I mean, like, it's not it's sufficient for you to trust simply consumer reviews when you're going to determine whether a car is reliable or not. You have to consult the professionals. And I'm going to tell you why you have to consult the professionals. You have to consult the professionals because they're going to be honest and they know what they're talking about because they know how to fix these cars when they break. Just because the car hasn't left you stranded doesn't mean the car is reliable. Moving on. I will tell you that car reliability peaked in the late 80s to the early 2000s. Here's why I say that. There was enough modern design to make them safe. So you had things like crumple zones. You had things about more stringent quality control from companies. They had simple electrics in most examples, except high luxury vehicles. So I'm not talking about your Rolls Royces. I'm not talking about even some of your Cadillacs. I'm not talking about your BMWs or your Mercedes Benzes. Those cars never have had simple electrics, at least not from this time period. And they had good quality materials compared to older cars from different eras. And many times, parts are still available. Frankly, parts are still very much available for cars of the 90s, unless you drive something super obscure like an Acura Vigor. But most people don't have those because, newsflash, those cars are rare. But get this. Here's what I'm telling you. I don't believe that new cars are the most reliable cars. And I don't believe that super old cars are the most reliable cars either. And I have decided to take the middle road. I am going to wait. Me personally, I'm going to wait before buying anything that has been made in this modern era of automobiles until these cars begin to age. Not only because I'm waiting for them to be cheaper because I can't afford them, but I'm also waiting to see which ones are the ones that are successful and which ones are the ones that fail. Because people, and you will find people will say, during the 1990s, when cars became more advanced, people are going to say, oh, they're putting all these technology in cars. They don't make them like they used to. Blah, blah, blah. It's not going to last. Yeah, I'm the same way. I tend to say the same thing, too. But looking back on the 90s, which was 20-something years ago now, you can tell that some of these cars were actually the real deal. Even though they put this technology in them, and we're talking about not technology like today. We're talking about, airbags and things of that sort. People were anti stuff like that. And they're like, oh, they're not reliable. They're going to blow up, blah, blah, blah. But, we're talking about cars of that era. We still see several cars of that era still running around. So I'm not telling you every single car made in the 90s is reliable. Some cars were absolute basket cases, but you also don't see them running around anymore because they were basket cases. I'm going to say the same thing needs to be said about cars of today. I'm going to wait at least 10 years before I go and buy a car that was made in 2016 to 2020 if I'm just going to put an arbitrary time period on that. Because I want to see which one of these cars held up, which ones have held up well, which ones have had known reliability issues over the long term, and which ones are still able, to be worth something as far as driving them, that you're not going to have to worry about changing some major component even if you buy the car used. That's when I'm going to wait. I will tell you that cars from this era nowadays, I am very skeptical that there will be much left running around after 10 years with every single system working. You can buy a car from the early 2000s in which everything works. Your CD player works. Your cassette player works. Your antenna, if it still had an antenna that went up and down, works. Your power door locks, your power windows, everything works. It's not uncommon for you to find a car that is 15 years old in which everything works. Because when you go back in time 15 years ago, not so much technology was pumped into cars that made them extremely unreliable to the point where here we are 10, 15 years later, the original owner is selling the car and he's like, yeah, this doesn't work, this doesn't work. No. I mean, those cars were simple enough that everything could still work. Take, not even an extremely expensive car today. Take your Ford Taurus, for example, and try to sell it 15 years from now. cars with screens, cars with this, cars with that. You're going to be like, yeah, the infotainment screen doesn't work, but the air still comes on, but you can't change it. That car is only 10 years old. Oh, the infotainment screen or the gauge cluster in the dashboard stopped working, but if you do this trick, you might get it to flicker on so you can see your mileage, blah blah blah. All of this is a bunch of foolishness. It's a bunch of foolishness. You can put a regular gauge cluster in a car. You don't have to put a gosh darn screen for everything, and to have your car still be modern, still have conveniences, and not be so much so to the point where when you go and try to sell the car, or when you go and buy a car from this era 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that everything is not going to work because all the screens have gone black because some fuse or something, or the screens don't work. Like, come on. I can only imagine what the used car market is going to be 10, 15 years from now, goodness. It's going to be a bunch of lemons. It's going to be a bunch of lemons because these cars were so, pumped full of technology and all sorts of other sorts of, unnecessary foolishness that you're not going to be able to find one that's reliable because everything is breaking. Oh, the radar cruise control sometimes breaks randomly, but if nobody's behind you, you don't have to worry about it. I mean, what on earth is this? And go and try to get it fixed at the dealer because it's no longer under warranty. They're going to cost you an arm, a leg, and a rack of ribs. And then they're going to be like, you might as well just get a new car. The car has too many electrical problems. You know why? Because dealers did this on purpose. Not dealers. Manufacturers did this on purpose. They put the car with all of this stuff. They knew that the stuff was going to break. When it breaks, they knew it was going to be terribly and prohibitively expensive to fix when it's no longer under warranty, thus totaling the car. And then they're going to ask you to take out a loan or to trade it in so you can buy another car, thus making the manufacturer more money. Planned obsolescence. It's a real thing. Look it up. Of course, I don't know. We might find that with the rise in electrical cars might start getting more reliable. Because I would be remiss to not mention to you that electrical cars are infinitely more reliable than gas cars simply because they have less moving parts and there are less things to break. I saw a Tesla Model S being sold the other day with 450,000 miles. Need I say more? I'm not pro-electric car. I don't like the prospect of electric cars taking over gas cars, but I will tell you, electric cars are and have always been more reliable than gas cars. Electric cars have been around for over 100 years now. The only reason why they never caught on is because they weren't as convenient. And they weren't as practical as gas cars. But they've always been more reliable. Because if your car gives a problem, you don't have to worry about your radiator getting busted or your head gasket blowing. Because guess what? You don't have a radiator and head gas because you don't have an engine. If your car is not producing the power that it should be, go and check your battery. Maybe a battery pack needs to be changed. You swap in a new battery pack, hook it up, you're fine. That's it. And of course, you have to worry about tires and suspension and all of those things because even though they're not engine, they don't have engines like traditional cars. They still have those things that need to be tended to. But they are much more reliable than gas cars. So before we have to go, let me quickly mention some of the cars that I believe are the most reliable from this era. Late 80s, early 90s. Lexus LS400. Ford Panther platform. These are your Ford Crown Victorias, your Lincoln Town cars, your Mercury Grand Marquis, and your Mercury Marauders. You've got any car with the Buick Series 2 3800 engine. This engine was put in Oldsmobile. This was put in Chevy. This was put in, obviously, Buick. It was put in Pontiac. It was put in a bunch of different cars. Any car with a Series 2 3800 engine from GM is infinitely reliable. Get Toyota Avalons, built well by Toyota. Very reliable. And you get Honda Accords. So don't let this podcast scare you from buying a new car. Granted, if your car is under warranty, you should be fine. It's just know that the car you bought back in 2005, brand new off the lot, might still be running with no problems. The car that you buy in 2020, 15 years from now, in 2035 might not be still running like your car that you bought in 2005, simply because of all the technology that they put into it. So thank you for listening to this edition of the GSMC Car Podcast. Please make sure to follow us, to like us on Facebook, to follow us on all of our social media, and please leave us a like and subscribe because that really helps us. And thank you, and have a wonderful night.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.